The 2024 NFL season is just a couple of weeks away, so in today's video, I decided to have a little bit of fun and talk about each team's best player heading into 2024. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about each team's best player heading into 2024. For each team, I'll give you guys a couple of people who I considered for the best player, and of course, the main player who I think is the best player. And because I don't want this video to be too long, I won't go into extensive details. So if you want more details about your favorite team, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button and check out the rest of my content. But let's hop into the video. So we're going to be doing this in alphabetical order, and we are going to begin with the Arizona Cardinals. Now for this Cardinals team, there is really not a standout player like a lot of other teams have, but this is a decent roster that I think has a couple of solid players. And I think of the guys who I consider to be star level talents, some guys I did consider were players like Trey McBride, Budda Baker, and Marvin Harrison Jr. But ultimately, I decided to go with Kyler Murray as this team's best player heading into 2024. I do believe that Kyler Murray is going to have an awesome season this year, now that he has a somewhat decent offensive line, a really good set of weapons around him, and an offense that should be overall much improved. I do believe that Kyler Murray is going to be able to return from his injury and play like he did in the late half of last year, but even on a higher level. Again, this is a team that doesn't really have stars all over the team, so it's really hard to kind of pick just one guy, but I think Kyler Murray is the one that stands out the most. Next up, let's talk about the Atlanta Falcons, a team that has a good amount of really good players. I wouldn't necessarily say there's any superstars in this team, maybe outside of a couple players. So with that being said, some players that I did consider were AJ Terrell, Chris Lindstrom, and Kirk Cousins. But ultimately, I did decide to go with Jesse Bates as their best player. Last year via PFF, he had a season grade of 90.6 and was named a first team All-Pro, and I think he was 100% worth it. He was a big reason why this defense last year was somewhat even relevant, and I think this year he's going to play an even bigger role on that defense. However, let's go ahead and move on to the Baltimore Ravens, a team that does have a bunch of star level guys. Some players I did consider were Roquan Smith, Kyle Hamilton, Justin Madubuike, and of course, Mark Andrews. But ultimately, I decided to go with the two-time MVP in Lamar Jackson. Last year via PFF, he had an 83.0 passing grade and a 92.5 rushing grade. And I just really think that this is one of the most special players in the entirety of the NFL. He's got that unique ability to be both a dominant rusher as well as a dominant passer. And he's, in my opinion, the hardest quarterback in the league to guard outside of like Mahomes and maybe Josh Allen. And yes, you can maybe give the guy like Roquan Smith, who is, in my opinion, maybe the best linebacker in the league, the slight nod over Lamar Jackson. But ultimately, I'm going to go with the guy who plays the harder position in Lamar. Next up with the Buffalo Bills, I feel like this one is very obvious. It is going to be Josh Allen, of course. Some people I did consider for this one were, of course, Matt Milano, Greg Rousseau, and Daquan Jones. None of those guys really stood out over Josh Allen. I think this one is maybe the easiest one of the teams I've talked about so far and throughout this entire list. Josh Allen is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the toughest guys to play against. He can dominate you with his legs. He can dominate you with his passing ability. This is a guy who has every type of talent that you would ever want in a quarterback. I think he's an awesome player, and I think this Bills team is set for life as long as they have Josh Allen. Next up, let's talk about the Carolina Panthers. Some people who I did consider for this award were Robert Hunt and J.C. Horn. A fully healthy J.C. Horn is a great player, but ultimately he just has got to stay healthy. But for the best player, I'm going to give it to Derrick Brown. I feel like he is kind of like the only bright spot on this team last year, both offensively and defensively. This team was an absolute mess, yet despite that, Derrick Brown actually had a really good season last year. He's never going to be a dominant pass rusher, but he is one of the league's best run stuffers, and you know, he can do a little bit in the pass rushing department as well. Last year he had an overall PFF grade of 90.9, which is one of the best in the defensive tackle position, and I do think as he heads deeper into his career, he's going to be having a long-term career for this Panthers team. However, next up, let's talk about the Chicago Bears, and there are a couple of people that we do have to talk about here. Some big name guys like DJ Moore and Keenan Allen have got to be given a lot of respect, but ultimately I'm going to give this to Jalen Johnson, who I think is pretty clearly their best player on this team. Last year he received a second team All-Pro with a 91.0 coverage grade via PFF, and he is just one of those cornerbacks that really stood out last year amongst not really great cornerback play throughout the league. He got himself a new contract, and he's now with the Chicago Bears for the long term, and I think this was an awesome pickup for them. With that being said, though, I do expect some players like Caleb Williams, maybe Rome Odunze, to potentially be the best player on this team next year, so for now it's Jalen, but we'll see how good Caleb is. Next up, let's discuss the Cincinnati Bengals. Some players who I did consider for this video were Ja'Marr Chase and Trey Hendrickson, but ultimately I gave it to Joe Burrow. My thought process on this one is that Joe Burrow plays the harder position than Ja'Marr Chase. Honestly, you can go either Ja'Marr or Joe Burrow. I really don't have an issue with who you pick. Ja'Marr Chase and Joe Burrow kind of struggled with injuries the past couple years, but when healthy, they are two of the better players in their respective positions. I just personally believe that when Joe Burrow is playing at his top level, fully healthy peak, we're talking about a guy who's arguably the second or third best quarterback in the league. Whereas with a guy like Ja'Marr Chase, it's pretty clear and definitive that guys like CeeDee Lamb, Devontae Adams, Justin Jefferson, and Tyreek Hill are maybe better, but definitely in the conversation to be better. Whereas when Joe Burrow is playing at his toppest level, there isn't really a quarterback who I'd rather have outside of Mahomes or Josh Allen or maybe Lamar. And those are some of the greatest players in NFL history, in my opinion. So I got to give Joe Burrow a ton of respect on this one. Next up, let's talk about their division rivals in the Cleveland Browns. A couple of players that you have to consider, but I think the obvious answer is going to be Myles Garrett. Some players I did consider were Amari Cooper, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, and Denzel Ward. But of course, Myles Garrett won Defensive Player of the Year last year, has arguably had a case to win multiple up to this point in his career, and is going to be in the conversation basically every single year for the rest of his career. Via PFF, he had an overall grade of 94.2, which is absolutely ridiculous. And he also had the PFF record, this is via PFF, for highest pass rush win rate with a percentage of 27.3, which is absolutely ridiculous. He's just a dominant player that does everything at an extremely high level. This one doesn't have to get a whole bunch talked about it. He's a dominant player. Next up, the Dallas Cowboys. This is a team that actually has a bunch of star talent that we can give a lot of honorable mentions to. So some of the names I did consider were CeeDee Lamb, Dak Prescott, DeMarcus Lawrence, Zach Martin, and Trevon Diggs. But despite that, I am going to give Micah Parsons the slight nod as the best player on this Dallas Cowboys team. Last year, he had a PFF overall grade of 92.5 with a pass rush grade of 93.7. And even though you could argue that a guy like CeeDee Lamb, who last year had over 1,700 receiving yards, is a better player, I'm going to give it to Micah Parsons just because I want to see what CeeDee Lamb can do next year. If CeeDee Lamb has another year with over 1,500 receiving yards, then I'll probably give him the slight nod over Micah. But as of right now, I do believe that Micah is the slightly better player. He's just been a bit more consistent throughout his entire career. Next up, the Denver Broncos. Again, this one's kind of obvious. I think this one's going to be Patrick Surtain. Some people I did consider were Courtland Sutton, Quinn Miners, and Garrett Bowles. I do believe that Quinn Miners does have an argument to be made here, but ultimately, I'm going to go with Patrick Surtain because I trust his body of work. Last year was not his greatest year in the NFL. He didn't have great PFF stats, and he didn't really get a whole bunch of interceptions or anything like that. But to be honest with you, I don't really think that we can blame Patrick Surtain for having a bit of a down year when the entirety of the Denver Broncos were an absolute mess for a lot of the year. But as we head into this new season, I do believe that Patrick Surtain is the best player on that defense and the best player on the entirety of the team. Next up, let's talk about the Detroit Lions. Some players I did consider for this video were Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jared Goff, Frank Ragnow, and Aiden Hutchinson. But ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to Penei Sewell. You can definitely make the case that Amon-Ra deserves to get this award and does deserve to be the best player on this team, but I believe that Penei Sewell is just a bit more dominant in his respective position. Amon-Ra is a very flexible guy who can play on the inside and on the outside and is going to be very consistent, but I think the potential for Penei Sewell to take an even more massive leap in 2024 is a little bit higher than what I can expect Amon-Ra to do. Last year, Penei Sewell had a 93.5 overall grade in PFF, and in my opinion, I think he's going to have a very similar year this upcoming year and just kind of prove to be this team's best player. Next up, let's talk about the Green Bay Packers. Some players I did consider on this one were going to be Xavier McKinney and Jordan Love, but ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to Jaire Alexander. I do believe by the end of the year that J Love is going to be the best player on this team, but honestly, I just can't give it quite yet to Jordan Love because he's only played like half of a good season thus far through his career. And even though, yes, he was on the bench for the majority of his career behind Aaron Rodgers, and then last year he had an awesome back end of his first year, I do gotta trust the body of work in Jaire Alexander a tad bit more. Next up, the Houston Texans. Some players I did consider for this video were Derek Stingley and Laramie Tunsil. But ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to the rookie sensation in CJ Stroud. You can call this a little bit of a hype train pick out of me, saying that CJ is the best player on this team. But ultimately, I just kind of think he is. I think he's already established himself to be potentially a top 10 quarterback. And because he's been able to do so, I don't really see how you cannot have this guy as the best player on this team. Next up, the Indianapolis Colts. A couple players I did consider for this award were DeForest Buckner, Quentin Nelson, and Kenny Moore, but ultimately I am going to go ahead and give this one to Jonathan Taylor, but this one's a little bit tentative as of right now. There's a lot of really good players, but this team just kind of lacks like that uber superstar like a Micah or Joe Burrow or somebody like that, and I think of the guys who I talked about thus far, I think the only names that you can really consider to be of that level are Quentin Nelson and Jonathan Taylor. But ultimately, Quentin Nelson just hasn't really been as good as he once was, even though he's still a great player. It's just been a while since we've talked about him as like the best guard in the league. Whereas despite the fact that Jonathan Taylor hasn't been able to play a whole lot because of injuries and contract issues, I still feel as if he's a top running back in this league. If you disagree, I do understand, but I'm going to give this one to Jonathan Taylor. Next up, let's talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars. A couple players who I did consider were Trevor Lawrence, Tyson Campbell, and Eric Armstead, but ultimately, this one's a little bit obvious. It's going to be Josh Allen. Last year in 2023, he had 16.5 sacks and had an 89.4 overall grade via PFF. And he just got himself a nice new contract and as well as a nice new brand name. Ultimately, I do believe Josh Allen's the best player on this team and definitely one of the better pass rushers in the league. Next up, the Kansas City Chiefs. A lot of players that we have to talk about on this team. Got to give credit to guys like Trent McDuffie, Creed Humphrey, Travis Kelce, and Chris Jones. But of course, it's going to be Patrick Mahomes. He's the best quarterback in the league. He's a sensational quarterback. I mean, he's one of the best quarterbacks of all time. Don't gotta talk too much in that one. Then we have the Las Vegas Raiders. A couple of players I did consider were Colton Miller and Max Crosby, but ultimately I am going to trust the body of work in Davante Adams for right now. I will say this, I do believe that Max Crosby by the end of this year will be the better player than Davante Adams, but because Davante is an all-time legend at this point in his career, I gotta give him a little bit of respect. Last year may not have been his best year, but despite the fact that he has Jimmy Garoppolo and Aiden O'Connell throwing him the ball, he's still managing to be one of the league's best quarterbacks, and in my opinion, the third best receiver in the league. So with that said, we'll see how it ends up next year, but for now, I'm going to give it to Davante Adams. Next up, the LA Chargers. Some players I did consider for this award were Asante Samuel Jr., Derwin James, Rashawn Slater, and Khalil Mack. But ultimately, I do kind of believe that this one is a pretty obvious one. Similar to the Buffalo Bills, it's going to be their stud quarterback, Justin Herbert. When Justin Herbert has a competent team around him, this is a guy who can lead this team very, very far. He puts up phenomenal stats, and I think once he starts to get a little bit adjusted to the system and the team starts getting better around him, this is going to be a Chargers team that has a lot of potential to be a really good team. Next up, the LA Rams. This one is honestly quite difficult because there's a couple of names that you do have to consider. I'm going to stick primarily on the offense here with Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, but in my opinion, the best player is going to be Matthew Stafford. When I look at these three players on this team, you just can't give it to Cooper Kupp after he's had a couple rough seasons with injuries the past couple years. And to be honest with you, I just don't feel comfortable quite yet giving it to Puka Nacua because he's only had 1 year of really good play, whereas Matthew Stafford has had 16 seasons of absolute domination. So because of that, I think Matthew Stafford is going to be the best player on this team, but we'll see how it ends up at the end of this year. Next up, let's talk about the Miami Dolphins. Some players I did consider for this list were Tua Tagovailoa, Jalen Ramsey, and Jalen Phillips, but ultimately, I gotta give this one to Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is one of the best, if not the best receivers in the entire league, and because of that, I don't really think there's an argument for anybody else. I love Ramsey, and I think that he is one of the league's best cornerbacks, and you can make the case he is the league's best cornerback, but I think Tyreek Hill is so good as a receiver and as a player, you gotta give him that respect. Next up, the Minnesota Vikings. Some players I did consider, and honestly, it was only one other player that I did even briefly consider. It was Christian Darrisaw, but ultimately, I'm going to give this one to Justin Jefferson. In my opinion, he is the league's best receiver in the entire NFL, and I think he's been that since maybe his second year in the NFL. I think he is an absolute star, and I think he has Offensive Player of the Year written all over him. Next up, the New England Patriots. This is a team that doesn't really have a whole lot of talented players or a whole lot of starred players, but I am going to give this one to Matthew Judon. Some players I did consider were Michael Onwenu and Kyle Duggar. I know Matthew Judon last year had some injuries and didn't have his greatest year when he was playing, but I got to give him his respect. He's been in the league for a couple years, has been a dominant player, one healthy, and I think he is one of their better players heading into 2024. Next up, the New Orleans Saints. A couple players we can consider here. A healthy Ryan Ramczyk is awesome, Tyrann Mathieu, and Chris Olave. But ultimately, I am going to give this one to Demario Davis, who even despite the fact that he is in year 13 of his career, he is still putting up some of his best numbers of his career. Last year, he had an 89.6 overall grade, which is surprisingly his second highest of his career, despite the fact that he's into his late 30s at this stage. He's an awesome player. Next up, let's talk about the New York Giants. Some players I did consider for this one were going to be Brian Burns, Andrew Thomas, and Kayvon Thibodeau, but ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to Dexter Lawrence. You can make the case that Andrew Thomas deserves this one because of how good he is at that tackle position, but ultimately, I just personally am going to go with Dexter Lawrence, who, in my opinion, graded out a tad bit better than Andrew Thomas did last year. He's also typically a lot more healthy. Last year, Dexter Lawrence had a 92.9 overall grade with an 89.5 run defense grade and a 92.6 pass rush grade. You can make the case that Dexter Lawrence is arguably the best defensive tackle in the league. I would probably put Chris Jones in front of him, and then you can make the argument for Christian Wilkins, but man, he's a dominant player. He can do a bit of everything. You gotta love him. Let's go ahead and move on to the New York Jets. Some players I did consider for this video were Aaron Rodgers, Breece Hall, and Sauce Gardner, but ultimately, I am gonna go ahead and give this one to Quinnen Williams just by a slight margin over Sauce Gardner. You can make the case for either player. These are both guys who grade out very highly in PFF. These are guys who on the field's production is just kind of speaks for itself, and I don't really feel like you have to go into too much detail. And as it goes for Aaron Rodgers, had he stayed healthy, he probably would have been the person who I would have said was the best player, but had a bad injury last year. We'll see if he can bounce back this year. Next, let's talk about the Philadelphia Eagles. Some players I did consider for this video were Jalen Hurts and Lane Johnson, but ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to A.J. Brown. He yet again had another fantastic season with Jalen Hurts as his quarterback, and even though I do think Jalen Hurts is a great quarterback, I ultimately think that A.J. Brown is a better player in his respective position. I think A.J. Brown is a clearly top 10 receiver in the NFL, whereas I think that there's an argument to be made that Jalen Hurts is not a top 10 quarterback. With that being said, though, I would not be surprised at all if Jalen Hurts has an awesome season this upcoming year and beats out a guy like A.J. Brown to be the best player on this team moving forward. Next up, the Pittsburgh Steelers. The couple players I did consider for this video were Minkah Fitzpatrick, Alex Highsmith, and George Pickens. But ultimately, of course, I'm going to give this one to TJ Watt. I feel like I don't really have to go into too much detail. He's a continuous Defensive Player of the Year candidate every single year. He gets a ton of stats. He puts together some great overall PFF grades. He just is the whole package as a pass rusher. You can make the argument he's the best edge rusher in the entire league. Next is the 49ers. A lot of really good and talented players that we could talk about for this video. So the players I did consider for this video were Trent Williams, Fred Warner, Nick Bosa, Brock Purdy, and George Kittle. But I am going to give this one to Christian McCaffrey, which might be a little bit of a controversial statement given how dominant that Trent Williams has been for his entirety of his career. But in my personal opinion, I personally believe that the gap between Christian McCaffrey and the next best running back is a little bit wider than, let's say, the gap is between Trent Williams and the best left tackle. I know that's not the perfect logic, but that's just kind of how my brain functions that one. Next up, the Seattle Seahawks. A couple players I did consider for this video were Devon Witherspoon and Leonard Williams, but I am going to go ahead and give this one to DK Metcalf. Last year, DK Metcalf had a pretty successful season. In my opinion, he is a really good receiver one in this league. And even though I do believe that in due time, Devon Witherspoon will be the best player on this team, I think as of right now, it's DK Metcalf. Next up, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Some players I did consider for this video were Vita Vea, Mike Evans, and Tristan Wirfs. But ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to Antoine Winfield. You can make the case that Antoine Winfield is the best safety in the entire league. Last year, he had an overall PFF grade of 90.7 with an 84.0 coverage grade, which were all career highs for him. I think for him, he had himself a performance that could have potentially won him a lot of awards last year, but he didn't quite win too many. And as we head into 2024, I think he's the best player on that team. Next up, let's talk about the Tennessee Titans. Some players I did consider for this video were DeAndre Hopkins and L'Jarius Sneed, but ultimately I am going to go ahead and give this one to Jeffrey Simmons. He didn't really have the dominant year that he had in typical standard for him, but he still had a pretty solid season, all things considered. So in my opinion, he is one of the league's most talented and maybe impactful players on the defensive side of the football, so I got to give him his respect. Right now, there really isn't anybody to kind of compare him to. But lastly, let's go ahead and talk about the Washington Commanders. Some players I did consider for this video were Jonathan Allen, Daron Payne, and Sam Cosmi, but ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to Terry McLaurin. He's just one of those consistent players that get you consistent production on the offensive side of the ball, and given the fact that he's had horrible quarterback play, I think his production kind of speaks for itself. I think he's the best player on this team. But per usual, if you guys agree or disagree with any of the picks I made in this video, let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button. And I love you guys. Peace.